you and your friends and the people who are involved in this stumbled onto something that seemed to have this really profound effect on people. This way of coming alive, of feeling feeling something that they couldn't feel in their regular day-to-day life. And just the story of it. And so I wanted to have more of a conversation about what that was like, and other things as well. But that's what kind of drew me, was seeing again something that the way in which people were connecting with themselves and connecting with each other, and especially the connection between the DJ and the crowd, the ability of the DJ to read the crowd and to blend music in a way that elevated them to these almost psychedelic experiences. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, it was it's something that has gone away from our environment, and it's not accessible, not easily accessible anymore. It's 1:09. We should start, shouldn't we? Because what you're saying is a good preamble.
Yeah. So, I mean, tell me more about what it was like. Like, when did you first have this experience yourself of being at a dance or a disco and noticing that there was something that was different that was happening?
I would say it was a lot earlier than the disco era. It was the dances that I attended, that my fraternity gave. That was the first type of experience like that. We've all been to house parties and, plenty of basement parties and so forth. But the dances that the fraternity gave, people dressed up, paid an admission. It was only a couple dollars, and heard live music. And we typically had two bands. Our competing fraternities and sororities also gave dances. So I had a chance to go to maybe 8 or 10 dances a year, big dances in ballrooms at hotels or other type of similar places. And when you're on the dance floor, you really do feel transported. That feeling was amplified by the discotheque experience because of the way the music was played. And you didn't have breaks like you do with a band who, they start a song and they end a song, they take a beat, then they start a new song. With the discotheque experience we had, featuring the latest technology, or fairly latest technology, in terms of music amplification and high fidelity and powerful, crystal clear sounds coming out of the speakers. And your favorite song, let's say, gets played in a way that by having two copies, you extend the length of the play. It was transformative, and it really elevated the feelings of euphoria and excitement and energy to an unprecedented level. And for lots of folks, it was so exciting, they couldn't stay away, couldn't get enough of it. As a result, I can tell you that in 1971, when we had the Ginza going and the La Martinique, we didn't own them. We had a couple of nights at each. It created a wave through the Black community all the way across the country. And I know that because in 1971, I went on my first business trip to Detroit, and I went to Motown. I knew they knew about us because everyone knew about us in the Black community. It had become, I guess, a word of mouth that was so powerful. Anyone who came to New York would hop a taxi and come to our clubs. And Muhammad Ali came. He heard about it. He didn't go inside. He stood at the door and just took a glance in there, but he heard about it and wanted to know what it was all about. And anyway, when I went to Detroit, I went by Motown, and the senior executives there knew all about us. And of course, the reason why they knew about us is because we were creating hits with their records. We played a lot of Motown. And later, other record industry executives learned that we had the capability, and other discotheques too, to create tremendous sales for records that never aired on the radio. Where did people hear this music? Why are they so adamant to buy those songs and in such big quantities? Discotheques. When people really enjoy a record, they rush over to the DJ and ask what song it is if they don't know it. And our DJ, Danny Berry, he was our primary DJ, along with Charles Perry. They were partners of mine. They would go to the record shops and a record warehouse and buy a whole case of a record that had never been played on the radio. And because they knew there was a demand for it, they'd sell copies of it at cost just to satisfy our guests. So very quickly, the record industry figured out how these records were accumulating such big sales because word of mouth, they heard about it. And I think it took time, but gradually that excitement and energy spilled over to other communities beyond the Black community. Because we had, especially in the early days, before there were 20,000 discotheques in the US, before that, there were very few. And you know what was unique about these discotheques? They attracted a very diverse crowd, more diverse, I would say, than any other purely social happening. I can't think of any occasion where you'd have that many diverse people and not just have them in the same space, but you'd have a CEO maybe dancing with a secretary or a mailroom clerk. You might have, and they don't even know what each other does because the environment we created, you felt comfortable inviting anyone to go out on the dance floor and dance with you. So it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, your crew had such an interesting blend of skills and talents because the decisions that you seem to make in terms of how to run this were so clear and seem to go hand in hand with the impact that you were able to have. The fact that there was such a strict dress code coming in mean that once everyone was inside, they were the same.
Exactly.
You know,
station in life meant nothing on the dance floor.
and the part that was fascinating to me was was it Frank was able to even create an atmosphere where gangsters felt comfortable.
Yes, yes. And we built an office in Queens where most of us lived at the time, and with a big round table, and all of us could sit there. And we talked through ad nauseum all the issues that we were going to face and had faced to figure out the best solution. So none of us had much experience. So we really used our joint judgment, a group judgment, to figure out policies. But you have to keep in mind that when we started, it was a very difficult time for New York City. Not only a huge economic crisis on the brink of bankruptcy, but the mafia controlled New York City to a great degree. Crime was at a really high level, violent crime. It was dangerous in New York. In fact, so dangerous, you had what's called white flight. And some Black folks left too and moved to the suburbs, and because it was safer. And only because of that did we have access to some of the premier spots in New York City who were hurting. And when we knocked on the door and said, we'll bring our crowd, our white collar business crowd, that was our target audience, people who were working in Midtown Manhattan for the first time. A whole cadre of young Black folks started working in Midtown and after work had no place to go. So we figured there's a business opportunity here, we'll give them a place to go. And that's how we first started, by going to these existing clubs, bringing in our crowd. They took the bar, we took the door. And after a couple of years, we started building our own clubs because there were too many restrictions, only one night. They had other things the other nights that corrupted our evening, other promoters, maybe different kinds of things going on. And in one case, the customers didn't like the idea of Black folks coming in every week on Thursday night, let's say. And it told the owner, if you let them come back, we're not coming back. So you got to get rid of these Black guys. So we faced some racism, but we dealt with it by building our own clubs.
Yeah, and And that, what was fascinating to me was, see, that's actually part of what I really love about this story is that when people came in, everyone was equal.
Yes.
And to some degree, that seemed to threaten a lot of other people. That there was such a thing, that there was such a thing where this experience where the constructs that people were used to and the hierarchies that people were used to just didn't exist the same way anymore.
That's exactly right. Our strict dress code was designed specifically to help protect ourselves and our guests because of the high crime in the area. We figured it would help with behavior and we could keep riffraff out. When people dress up, they tend to behave nicer. And it worked. It worked to a great degree, especially considering how out of control crime was. A lot of a tremendously high murder rate and robberies and rapes and all kinds of bad things happening in the city. So a lot of folks thought the city would never recover and it would lose its position as the financial capital of the country. Of course, it did not lose that position. It gained strength. It took about another 10 years, but New York City recovered and rents shot up so high. That's why discotheques don't exist like they used to. It's so expensive. When we opened our doors, it was $3. Our first discotheque, $3 to get in. Anyone can afford that. And we gave you a free drink. And the venue provided a free Chinese buffet. So you can have dinner and a drink for $3 and you're in a discotheque dancing. So that era will never come back. It's today it might be $100 to get in.
Yeah.
And because of that high price, you wouldn't have the same dynamic. You would have older people who have the money and they simply don't dance as much. So very interesting. But I do think your premise about how stories can change people's attitudes, yes, it can. And for us, the stories were mostly word of mouth. The word of mouth is what drove our success. But because of the tremendous visibility we generated and the word of mouth, a lot of people came down to our clubs who otherwise would not go to a nightclub in Manhattan. But they heard so much about our clubs. I'm talking about within the Black community primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. And as a result, dozens and dozens of people were married who met at our clubs. Can't tell you how many people have stopped me to tell me they met their wife at one of our clubs. And many of them were married at our clubs or had the reception at our clubs. So it does change and affect people's lives. That's pretty significant.
Yeah, and your story of how you met your wife was also fascinating because in walks this woman who's got the biggest afro you've seen, and you wanted to see it was real.
Right,
So
that's right.
Behind her and told her.
I pulled the hat. I didn't plan to do it. It just was, it's interesting. I was thinking about it after, all these years later. I probably had a slightly more aggressive approach, given that I was in control of the club. It was my club. If it was someone else's club, I don't think I would have pulled her hair, because you never know who else is in the room, or I felt comfortable in the space because it was all my people. I knew nobody was going to come hit me in the head. But I'll tell you, I do think that the reading the book, for example, reminds people of how that world used to be. Either it reminds them or educates them about how that world used to be, because that level of diversity and acceptance, not just diversity, but acceptance and interaction is, for those who were there, they remember it. And I think it makes them realize in this current highly divided world that we can go back to that kind of environment once again, because we had it. It existed, and it wasn't that long ago. So human beings can get along in certain environments and cut that divide that we currently have, get rid of that divide where there is none. I think
Yeah,
the world could use some discotheques today, I'll tell you that.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. I think I would too. There's some parallels to the stories that are just so clear in my mind right now. One of them is this, it's just, this story is about a couple hundred years old, but it's a story about, how there were, a synagogue of Jews praying, and their sense that, their leader had a special connection to above, and he sensed that their prayers weren't getting through. He felt like God was not happy, and it just wasn't breaking through. And so he towards the end of the day went around the city, and he rounded up all the thieves, and he brought them into the synagogue. And he said, "These guys are good at unlocking doors, so maybe they'll help us get our prayers through." And they did.
Wow.
And the other thing is that, um, the clubs, so you kept them strictly drug-free, which was so interesting because people were getting these psychedelic experiences, but there was
Yeah,
a very strict rule against, and if anyone did drugs, they got banned, which was horrible because there was nowhere else to go.
exactly right. It was a stiff penalty that everyone wanted desperately to avoid.
Yeah. And that also reminds me, because there was a guy doing work, and I think in the 70s, his name was Stanislav Graf, and he was trying to heal people with PTSD using LSD and other psychedelics,
Hmm.
and they got banned. And so as a replacement, he developed something called holotropic breathing, which is basically breath work while listening to fast-paced, intense music,
Hmm.
to also give people similar psychedelic experiences. So it's just fascinating to me that, again, the way in which you guys stumbled on something that was having such a profound, and I would even say healing effect on people. And I definitely, I mean, obviously, when you get people together socially, you have chances of people meeting each other and getting married and starting families. But it seemed like there was an abnormally large amount of that happening at these discos because people were just connecting in a very unusual way.
Yes, I would say that I know for a fact that many partnerships were, like business partnerships were formed. Some people were hired. One of the top DJs in the country was Vaughn Harper in New York. I don't know if you remember Quiet Storm, WBLS, a big station. It used to be much bigger, going back in time than it is today. In fact, it was the #1 station in the Northeast, not just New York. And when Frankie Crocker was the famous DJ from the 70s. Anyway, Frankie Crocker heard Vaughn Harper introducing a live act we had. We had live music every Thursday night. And he was so impressed with his voice, deep, velvety voice and wit, combined with wit. And while Vaughn was busy introducing the act, Frankie Crocker shouted out, "You have a voice that should be on radio." And Vaughn immediately shot back, "Well, hire me." They talked afterwards, and he went to DJ school, which you have to do. And next thing you know, he's the top DJ on WBLS, and he replaced Frankie Crocker to a great degree. So,
Wow.
so very interesting. So I know that's only one job, but I'm sure there were others as well, because we had a lot of music executives that came down there, label heads, record company executives, and radio station executives. They came because they needed to know what's turning on this crowd that's buying so many records. And so a lot of them became good friends and became fixtures at our clubs.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it was an exciting time,
So,
very colorful.
so what was it like for you? So you first experienced dance just as part of a fraternity, and
Right.
then you guys just started driving around trying to find. The one time you guys drove all night and you didn't even find it. You just
That's
drove.
correct. Looking for a party. Yeah.
Um, And then it started becoming a business, and then it started becoming a really big and very demanding business. Were you still able to enjoy the dancing experience, or as you started running this big operation, or did it kind of in a way become such a demanding task that were you still dancing while you guys in the 71, 72, 73 were running this whole thing?
Well, some of my partners quit their day jobs in order to run the business, because someone's got to be there to order the liquor and, pay the fill out the quarterly income tax statements, and workers' compensation has to be paid monthly. All kinds of things have to happen. So 4 of the guys quit their day jobs. I did not. And so some of them did dance, and I have pictures of them on the dance floor, so I know they were dancing on occasion, at least. For me, not at all. I had a day job. I was at Young and Rubicam Advertising, at the time the largest ad agency in the country. It was very demanding, and I was working my way up from a low level, from account coordinator to assistant account executive to account exec and account supervisor. So I got promoted a few times, but what that meant was I'm working roughly 4 nights a week and getting virtually no sleep that night. So the next day I was really crushed up if I had to go to work, and I had to perform. And so when I went to the clubs, my job was to collect cash at the door. So I wasn't even inside. I was at the entrance. I was always at the entrance. That's all I did, collect cash at the door. Not so comforting to have an employee collecting all that cash, because they're not always as trustworthy. There's no way to really monitor it. We had a guy with clickers, a clicker, I should say, to count the heads coming in, but it wasn't always consistent. They might not have been there early. They came, a little later, or, they didn't show up that night or whatever. So the clicker was good, but it wasn't enough. And there was fluctuation in the door take that probably shouldn't have been there. So we actually had one partner who borrowed money, as he called it, and paid it back, but he borrowed it without permission. So we got rid of him because he didn't tell us he borrowed it. We asked him what happened to the money. And so in other words, he probably wasn't going to say anything if we didn't know it. But we had to get rid of him. And, it was a very difficult time for me personally, because I was basically on a sleep deficit all the time. So it was not fun for me after a while. It was almost drudgery, to be honest. It was very difficult. Yeah, I enjoyed talking to the people as they came in and as they left, because, they were in such a great mood. They were dressed up and happy and excited to come in, and so thankful on the way out, and appreciative. And that's what I heard at the door. It was a great night. See you next time, that kind of thing. We enjoyed it. And in the early days of the disco eras, when we first started giving our first discos in 71, people said much more to me. They said, wow, this is really exciting. They'd never experienced anything like that. They said that to me. This is great. This is an occasion when we had music like Theme from Shaft with 2 copies. We keep that riff going, the bridge going over and over, and it drove people crazy. They just loved it to a point where that was what generated the word of mouth that spread across the country, the entire country. Black community is more insular and fewer degrees of separation, and the word of mouth spread like wildfire. It ignited something that didn't exist before. And you know what we did? I guess you read this. We invited promoters from DC, Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, and Chicago. Only DC and Philly came, and we got a suite in a hotel near the airport, and put together a flip chart presentation and showed them everything we did and how we did it, with the reason for the dress codes and all that stuff, how we handled the big time gangsters without any problems, and how we promoted it. We kept it kind of under the radar to a degree because we wanted more of a college-oriented crowd. They didn't have to go to college or anything, but we wanted a little bit more sophistication than just the average person. And that's what we reached out for, and that's what we got. Anyway, DC and Philadelphia, both those groups put together successful discotheques in their towns, and they did very well. We knew we couldn't expand to their cities. We didn't know anybody there. Certainly not enough to generate a following that easily. We'd have to physically move there to do that. So we figured this is an opportunity for others to do what we're doing and make some good money and have fun. And it might be a window that closes, because I always felt discotheques are not going to be around forever. Nightclubs never are. And so, we figured we should share it before the opportunity disappears.
Why do you think something like this didn't last, at least amongst the people who knew what it was like and what kind of an experience it was? What do you think this from starting?
I can tell you the main reason why it didn't last. But first, I'd say it lasted a lot longer than most clubs. Our flagship was Leviticus. Now, keep in mind, we had events we were promoting for several years before that. We started in '71. We opened our first our first club in Manhattan in 1974. So for 3 years, it was going on, and Leviticus stayed open until '86. So that's a long, 15 years of discotheques, which is a long time. What happened was, I mentioned the economic problems New York City was having. The city became profitable around the early '80s. And they had money. They were bringing in money, and they solved their financial woes. More cops on the street. They got rid of the mafia. Giuliani went after the mafia heads and got rid of the mafia to a great degree, weakened them to the point where they weren't much of a factor anymore. Rents in New York City and real estate prices shot up like crazy. The rents for the spaces we had became astronomically expensive, and we had no choice but to close them down one by one as the leases expired, because landlords realized what they can get, and that's what they did. They got the big rents.
Was there ever the thought of taking the same experience to smaller places that might not have the same issue with rent?
Yes, that's what some of my partners did. Two of my partners actually did that. Tony Cooper and Danny Berry built a club in Queens, which was a lot less expensive, right in, basically our old neighborhood. And they ran that for 30 years after the 15-year run of our discotheques in New York, in Manhattan. So that's 45 years of operating discotheques till they retired just a couple of years ago.
And so it closed down because they retired, or it closed down because the business couldn't?
They retired.
So this is still a viable, so this would still be, if someone were to open this today in a place where rents are not, this is still a viable idea.
Well, let me say this, the club they opened was a good sized club, but it wasn't like a discotheque in the traditional sense. They had dancing, but that was not the main attraction. It was more of a local club that had on occasion live music, different kinds of celebrations, parties, and they also had disco nights, but it didn't rely on and didn't replicate the way the original discotheques operated, which were astronomical volume, just massive speakers, and you're immersed in an environment that's you forget all your problems. This local club they had was not quite like that, so it was more of a broader array of entertainment.
I hear, yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing that really that fascinated about me. And one of the favorite parts of the book was this quote here from, I think, Frankie Knuckles, where it says, "Here you could forget your earthly troubles and escape to a better place, like church to promise freedom. And not even in the next life. In this club, Frankie Knuckles took his congregation on journeys of redemption and discovery. It was people just found something right then and there that was just another experience.
Yeah.
Um,
There's something I should also mention. Now, Frankie Knuckles was a lot younger than us and catered to a younger crowd. As we aged and our friends aged, they also danced less often.
mm,
In fact, I would say most people who are my age can't do the penguin anymore. You have to get up on the balls of your feet and go back and forth to the beat of the music. Not easy to do when you're 77.
no, you need a young crowd to
We
do
were in
that.
our 20s. Yeah,
Yeah.
in 20s, you could dance all night.
And it affects the room. You need enough young people in the room with
That's right.
nonstop energy, and it takes the whole room along.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Because some people, I got an email the other day or a message from someone who went to our clubs back in the old days. And he said, unlike most people, I can't dance. So he said he enjoyed it by watching. And, I'd never seen a message like that before. But I can appreciate that because once you were inside, you were immersed. You couldn't avoid the music. And it was not a place to have a conversation, although you could talk a little bit, but you had to talk loud. It truly was immersive.
Yeah, there's something I think deeply spiritual about dancing, and it affects the people watching it. Obviously, you need the people who are dancing to do that work, but it really affects. It really takes everybody along.
Yes.
There's something that I found recently that I really was a very, very deep and an interesting experience. It's called ecstatic dance. An ecstatic dance is you get a group of this. It seems like a very similar idea. You get a group of people together, and music plays like someone's kind of doing the DJ work and making a playlist, and people dance. Now they're not dancing specific moves. You're just kind of dancing whatever you feel like dancing, but you're getting a group of people together dancing. And they have this going on now, and they even have it going on now over Zoom. So people getting together and just dancing over on the Zoom call. And it's a really, it's a very, very deep and connecting experience. And often people will, after the dance, open up and start sharing with each other. It becomes a very close group. And so I see it, it definitely has it's definitely very different than disco, but I see in that a similar thing of where people are now finding the power of music, dance, and connecting with each other. And it's, and finding a very deep and, spiritual and emotional connection through doing that.
I'll have to check that out. I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I'll send you some info after the call of the things that I've seen. But it's it's wild. One of my favorite stories in the book, it wasn't necessarily connected to dancing, but was how your mother got you out of the draft.
Yes.
That was just that was powerful.
Yes, it was. And I was shocked. We got home, I said, Mom, I didn't know you knew all that. Yeah.
Is there more to that story than what's in the book of what that?
Yes, there is. The thing is, the last surviving child, ruling, whatever you want to call it, was something that you had to request. In other words, you were not exempt from the draft automatically if you're the last surviving child. You have to request a hearing and request it. And very few people did that, apparently, because when my mother requested a hearing with the draft board, she didn't have a problem setting it up. And, it wasn't like there was a line of people waiting to meet with the draft board. There was nobody in front of us and nobody behind us. So I don't think many people took advantage of that. If you didn't request it, you didn't get it. Now, I was not the last surviving child. I had two brothers, both in the Air Force, and one in the Air Force, one in the Army, both in the service. But because my mother requested it, and they probably got so few requests, I was thinking after the fact, that's probably why they said, okay, we'll give this guy a waiver. We'll let him out. As it turned out, my brother, who was in the Air Force, served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and he died 3 months after he came home in a car accident.
Oh.
So that was really, it changed the family forever. We were never the same. He was, every family has someone who's the most vivacious and popular in the family. That was my brother. And this is before the era of seatbelts. And he died. If he had a seatbelt, he would have survived. But there were no seatbelts in cars back then. This was in the 60s. So thank God they have seatbelts today.
Yeah.
And better engineering up front.
I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah. So had I been drafted, it would have been, I probably would have been in Vietnam on the front line with a very good chance of dying in the field there, with so many soldiers died, so many, especially at that particular time when they drafted me. So I don't think if I came back, I probably would not have been the same either. I've met quite a few people who came back, and it didn't change them for the better either.
Oh, no.
That's a tough trauma. You talk about PTSD. Yeah, it's a tough trauma to deal with.
Did you have any friends or people you knew who went through the war, who came to the discos and found it to be helpful for the trauma that they went through?
I didn't know anyone personally quite like that, so I'm sure we had folks who benefited from the therapeutic value of discotheques, but I don't personally have any stories to share. Some of my partners probably do, because I was always at the door, and my partners who quit their day jobs were always inside on the nights that I worked, and there were 4 of us took turns working the door, and the other 4 were inside the club, because they work full time for the business, and they knew much more than I would working the door. I didn't have a chance to chat all night long with customers, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. So how many hours? So the club was open until 4 in the morning. It would open at how many hours would you be standing there for?
All night till 4:45 when we all walked out.
Did you have a chair or you were standing the whole time?
I had a stool.
Wow.
And, yeah, so I sat. It was like a booth where you pay admission to go into a movie. It was that kind of a booth.
How many years?
Glass. It was open, just a counter, and it closed.
And how many years were you doing that while you were holding a marketing job and building a family?
5 years, 6 years, 71 to 76.
How did you survive that?
Well, initially, we didn't have that many nights. Initially, it was just Thursday night, then we added Tuesday and Sunday. And so we took turns with my partners working the door. So I didn't have to work. I didn't work 4 nights a week. I might have worked 2 nights a week. And one of them would have been the weekend. So it wasn't all that bad. But when we started building our own clubs in Manhattan, Leviticus opened in 74, which is open 7 nights a week, of course. And then Justine's the following year, 7 nights a week. And then Brandy's in Brooklyn. I didn't spend much time in Brooklyn. I worked the clubs in Manhattan because I worked in Manhattan at Young and Rubicam. And then Benton and Bowles after that. And basically what I did was just walk over to the clubs after work. You know, I'd pick up a sandwich, remember Sarge's? Sometimes go to Sarge's, get a big corned beef sandwich and carry with me over to Leviticus and eat in the booth before anybody arrived. And I stay there all night.
I think the thing that people, at least I couldn't even imagine, but what I don't think a lot of people realized was that there were so many reasons why, even though you guys are running a very successful business and you could have afforded to hire people to do your jobs, you were the only people who could really do them.
Yeah, we did hire someone. In fact, he was our banker. He was the branch manager of the bank we banked at, and he was a good personal friend. So he took the door on occasion, and we fully trusted him. And it was always it was never an issue with him. It was always the proper amount of money that he collected based on the crowd inside. Some of us could look at the crowd and tell how much money should be in the till from the door admissions, and also what kind of bar night you're going to have, because if you have some of those big time mobsters coming in, they would spend a lot of money. And so we knew the take at the bar would be pumped up when they're in the room. And, so it basically was champagne. That's what they drank, champagne. I think they modeled it after the mafia. They learned a lot from the mafia. You know, guys like Nicky Barnes and Joey Gallo got to be good friends in jail. And Nicky Barnes formed a council modeled after the mafia. The Five Families had their version of the council, and I think Nicky Barnes formed the same thing and had similar kinds of rules. So it was interesting how they shared that intellectual information and business management information. And basically the guys that came to our club, they were looking to have fun because there were so few places in the city that they could go to and be fully respected and accepted.
Yeah. And you guys have the skill to do that. I mean, there's really not someone you can hire, or it'd be hard to find someone you can hire, even find that would know how to handle these kinds of people in a room and make them comfortable and everyone feel comfortable around them. It was fascinating. You know, it's not just a room with music playing in a certain way. There's a lot that went into creating that environment. In my work, that's a very big theme of, holding space. Like sometimes processes can only happen if you're holding the right space for that person. If you're setting the right context, you have to know, there needs to be a certain feeling of safety, a certain feeling like things are okay no matter what happens. And doing that is being able to do that for people, and being able to do that for people at scale. It seemed to be that was a really unique skill set that your group had.
Yeah, I credit Tony Cooper, our president, with guiding us on that. When I say guiding us, basically we just watched the way he handled it, and I guess we kind of just emulated it. And I say we, it's more my partners who work every day than myself or my other partners who just worked the door because we had day jobs. Those who work the club every day had to recognize that there are certain things that you have to do to maintain the relationship. For example, and you read this in the book, I'm sure, we had a group of hustlers, to use a loose term, who did illegal things, drive up. They're not dressed properly, so they can't get in, but they didn't want to come in. They wanted to buy a bottle of champagne. So it's illegal to give someone a bottle of champagne who's not in the club. because, back then you had to consume it inside the club as a licensee. But we took the risk because we wanted to maintain the relationships, and the relationships are very important. And so we bent the rules a little bit. We broke the law, I guess you'd say, in order to make sure that we maintain the relationship with these guys, because they could be really big troublemakers. So which trouble do you want to get in? I'd rather have them on feeling reasonably good about us. And one thing we never did, which is why the mafia, never really came after us. A junior guy tried to, but he was pulled back. But we never asked for money, never asked to borrow money. We were never late with rent. We didn't ask for any favors, and we didn't do anything that was illegal that they could see. And I just pointed out one thing we did that's illegal, but that's not something the mafia would take notice of. An occasional car pulling up and looking for a bottle of champagne. That might have happened once or twice. But what the mafia did back then, I don't know if they do that today, they go after organizations where, they need to borrow money, or they're doing something illegal, like they have, undocumented workers. They're doing something illegal that gives the mafia leverage over them. And that way they can extort them. And that's how they operate, or that's how they used to operate. I'm not sure how they do it today. Like I said, Giuliani weakened them enormously because he got rid of all the heads of the families, put them in jail, most of them. But I know Bonanno didn't go to jail for long. They didn't have a big enough charge against him. It was like obstruction of justice or something, and he was in jail for only a year or so. And he lived till 90 something. He was over 90 when he died. Joe Bonanno, tough guy. And I understand, I just saw a documentary on Netflix about him, and the Godfather character that Marlon Brando played is modeled after Joe Bonanno. A very friendly guy, warm, takes care of his family, looks out for the neighbors and the neighborhood, very generous, but he's a murderer. And he steals. But the outer impression is he's a nice guy, he's big personality and very generous, just like the character Marlon Brando portrayed in The Godfather. And, like a fair, honest guy, but he's a murderer.
Yeah, people are interesting.
Yeah.
One of the saddest parts of the book was this scene where towards the end of the disco era, where you had, it seemed like there was like an owner of the baseball team that was involved in this, but they just made this huge event where between games they just brought as many records that they had of disco and just exploded them in the middle of a stadium.
Yes. Yeah, they stormed the field. This was Steve Dahl, a popular DJ, real big DJ in the Midwest. He was originally from Detroit, but he moved to Chicago because they changed the station from rock, which is what he favored and played, to disco, which he hated. And so he moved to Detroit and staged a disco demolition night. And he asked everyone to bring a disco record to be blown up on the infield between games of a doubleheader with the White Sox. And people came with records, not just disco records, but any record by Black people. And so it makes you realize that there was a cultural aspect to the dislike of disco. Disco was championed and embraced heavily and created heavily by Blacks and Latinos and gays. And that kind of pushed white middle class, white males a little bit to the side, because they felt rock was their thing, and rock was being replaced by disco on a lot of radio stations. 200 stations across the country changed their format to disco. That really incensed them. And Steve Dahl was quoted as saying, dress up to go? No, pay admission to get in? No. Learn to dance to get the girl? Hell no. So that gives you an idea of the cultural difference. He was more of a blue jeans kind of guy, I guess. So he would have had a hard time getting into our club unless he dressed up, as he put it. Back then it was a dressier environment overall. And in my world, people enjoy getting dressed up. It's a different world today, but that's the way it used to be. And one thing I should mention, the book you keep referencing is After Dark, Birth of the Disco Dance Party, which is available on Amazon and also at Barnes and Noble, bookstores, wherever books are sold.
Yeah, I was definitely gonna mention that. Anybody who's listening to this, it's an amazing book, After Dark, by our guest here, Noel Hankin. It's an incredible story of what Noel and his friends did to create this revolution in the way people connected and spent time with each other and how they experienced music. But what was it like for you when you saw that happening, and knowing that this wasn't so simple as people not liking your music, because they weren't just bringing disco, they were bringing anything by a Black artist, right? So
Yes,
it was,
yes.
and especially when, you guys didn't create disco as a Black thing.
No.
Like it was just, the environment that you created just equalized everybody. It was Black, Latino,
yes.
gay,
In
criminal.
fact, we played a lot of music by white folks also. Dennis Coffey, we helped make that record, Scorpio, which was never played on radio. And incidentally, Frankie Crocker used that as his theme song after he heard it at our club, Scorpio by Dennis Coffey. And he embraced it. He had other theme songs too, but he used that one as well. Danny Berry was the one that found that. But we had, of course, the biggest disco performer of all, who sold the most records by far, was the Bee Gees. And, Nile Rodgers was also big with his array of songs that he came out with, big hits. And those guys were, they got a cold shoulder, even death threats. They were, the industry really turned its back on disco after the word disco lost favor. It became so popular and so abused with garbage, create garbage songs or acts and put the word disco on it, and just brought the word disco down. The music never lost favor, but the word disco certainly did.
I know it did, because until I came across you on LinkedIn and read what was going on here, I thought disco was just some cheap kind of cheesy thing.
Yeah.
Keep
in mind, when we started, there was no such thing as disco music. What we played, to me, was the best era for disco music. Songs like Girl, You Need a Change of Mind by Eddie Kendricks, or Theme from Shaft by Isaac Hayes, or Celebration by Kool and the Gang. Those kinds of songs had lyrics that gave you an emotion. And disco music eventually evolved into more mechanical, computer-driven sounds without lyrics in many cases. And that to me was much less exciting or interesting. That's like electronic music. That's where disco headed. But where it started was Motown, Sound of Philadelphia. James Brown, we played a lot of James Brown early on. His music is never considered disco music, but in our early 71, 72 years, we played a lot of James Brown. He got people up on the dance floor, that heavy, powerful beat.
Do you have do you have recordings? I know we're up on time here, but do you have recordings of what Danny and the guys that you had at your discos used to play? Like a whole set of what they do? I'm so curious to hear what it would have actually sounded like
Yeah, you know,
in the
when I
70s.
when I first started writing the book, when I first thought of writing the book, my thought was to include a CD with a mixed array of music, but because of the legal aspect, the rights, it gets so complicated, I abandoned that idea. And I actually figured without that, the book is not as interesting. And I didn't, that was 10 years ago. And I decided not to write the book anymore because I was busy doing other things. Well, after a while, I realized that when my generation dies out, no one's going to know what role we played in helping to ignite the disco craze among Black folks, at least as a starter. And then others joined in. Next thing you know, it became a national and international phenomenon. And it did have value, especially in the early years. It brought people together. When you had 20,000 discotheques in the US, it became more segmented, where people went to a discotheque that had people like them. That's what tended to happen. But when you had very few discotheques, everybody came to the same place. So there was nothing else like Leviticus when we opened the doors. Nothing. You had some so-called underground clubs, meaning they didn't have proper licensing, and they were in the edge of town. We were smack dab, right off Fifth Avenue.
Well, if I could find a way to get my hands on one of those recordings, I'd be so curious to hear what it's like.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to make a note. I'm going to reach out to Danny Berry, who I know always had recordings of his mixing because he was really good at it. And I'm going to see if he has something that he can share with me, but I can't share it publicly because of the rights. But I must say, the way he did it, and at that time, 71, no one in our crowd had ever experienced anything like that before. Going from one record to the next without missing a step on the dance floor. That had never happened before. That's what was so fresh and original and exciting. And and we were in our early 20s, mid 20s, and it took people to a level because they could easily continue to dance for the extended period of time, whatever the length of time was. The length of time was not a problem. Today it would be. I need a break after a while. So
yeah. Fascinating. Okay.
If I get that CD or a tape, whatever he has, if I get it, I'll share it with you.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Noel. Thanks so much for doing this. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation.